September 1940. The air raid sirens have long since become familiar to the people of Wiltshire. Above the rolling countryside between the villages of Box and Corsham, the Luftwaffe sweeps overhead in steady, relentless waves, hunting for anything that moves, anything that builds, anything that fights back. Far below, in the old limestone quarries that honeycomb the earth beneath these quiet English hills, something extraordinary is taking shape. 37 metres underground, in tunnels carved from pale Bathstone, men and women in overalls walk briskly down dimly lit corridors with purpose written in every step. The air smells of stone dust and oil. The temperature is constant, cool, sealed off from the burning world above. These workers do not look up at the sky, they cannot see it. They carry components, check manifolds, record serial numbers, and attend to the careful, exacting work of building aircraft engines. All while bombs fall somewhere in the countryside above them, and searchlights sweep uselessly through smoke-thick skies. Nobody outside these walls knows this place exists. That is, of course, the point. What lies beneath the Cotswolds is not merely a factory. It is a statement of intent, a declaration, carved in rock, that Britain will not be broken by what falls from above. While Hitler's bombers hunt for the industrial heart of England and find plenty to destroy, thousands of workers are producing the means of Britain's survival in a location that no aerial photograph will ever betray, that no informant can credibly describe, and that no bomb, no matter how precisely aimed, can reach. This is the story of the Corsham tunnels, a secret so large, so enduring, and so staggering in its ambition that even after declassification, it struggles to be believed. A city beneath England, built in darkness, kept in darkness, and never, in the full span of its extraordinary life, used for the purpose it was ultimately designed to serve. To understand why such a place was built, you must understand the particular terror of the autumn and winter of 1940. The Battle of Britain had been decided in the skies above southern England, but it had not brought comfort. The Blitz had begun in September, and the Luftwaffe had shifted its ambition from defeating the Royal Air Force in daylight to dismantling British industry and civilian resolve under cover of night. The calculations were brutal and simple. Britain needed aircraft. To build aircraft, it needed factories. Factories were large, immovable, and visible from 20,000 feet. German bombers, guided by the fires of previous raids and by navigation beams that the British were desperately working to jam, were targeting those factories with increasing precision. The Bristol Aeroplane Company's works at Filton, just 12 miles west of Corsham, had been hit on the 25th of September 1940. The attack killed 91 workers in a single raid and wounded nearly 200 more. Production halted. The message was clear enough. The Air Ministry had already identified the problem before that catastrophe, but the raid at Filton stripped away any remaining arguments for delay. Dispersal of industry had been discussed since 1938. The concept was straightforward. Move production out of obvious concentrated targets and into locations that the enemy could not easily find or destroy. Shadow factories in provincial towns, underground facilities carved from existing mines and quarries. Anywhere, in other words, that was not the sort of large, roof-lit building that showed up perfectly well on a reconnaissance photograph. The limestone quarries beneath Corsham had been worked since Roman times. Bathstone, the warm, honey-coloured oolitic limestone that gives the city of Bath its particular beauty, had been cut from these seams for centuries, leaving behind extensive underground voids of considerable size and stability. By the early 20th century, quarrying had largely ceased, but the tunnels remained deep, dry, structurally sound, and conveniently located alongside the Great Western Railway main line between London and Bristol. A branch line already served the area. The infrastructure, in other words, was already present. From the moment the decision was made to go underground, work proceeded at a pace that the crisis demanded. Thousands of workers were brought in. The quarry was assessed, reinforced, and subdivided. Power was run in. Ventilation shafts were sunk. And slowly, in the peculiar quiet of the rock, an underground factory unlike anything Britain had previously attempted began to take shape. The facility that emerged from this effort was not a simple workshop or a storage depot. It was, by any reasonable definition, a self-contained industrial city. And it was built and operated in conditions of near total secrecy that would be maintained in some form for more than 60 years. Spring Quarry, as the site was formally designated, came under the control of the Ministry of Aircraft Production in 1940. The Bristol Aeroplane Corporation took charge of the manufacturing operation, relocating critical elements of its engine production program underground. What workers arrived to find, and what they steadily transformed, was a complex measuring roughly 35 acres of floor space, spread across multiple connected chambers and galleries carved from solid limestone, at a depth that placed them entirely beyond the reach of any bomb then in German service. The scale of the engineering challenge was immense. The tunnels had to be fitted with the full infrastructure of a working factory, electrical supply capable of running precision machinery, ventilation systems sufficient to clear the heat and fumes generated by metalworking operations, water supply, drainage, internal transportation corridors wide enough to move large components, and living and welfare facilities for a workforce that, at its wartime peak, numbered in the thousands. Estimates of the total workforce in the underground complex vary, and some records from this period remain classified or were never fully disclosed. But contemporary accounts suggest that several thousand people were employed in the tunnels at any one time during the busiest years of production, with additional security and support personnel bringing the total population of this subterranean world considerably higher. The workers came mostly from the Bristol area. Many had transferred from the Filton factory after the bombing. They were sworn to silence, not through dramatic ceremony, but through the ordinary weight of wartime secrecy. The understanding, drummed into every worker at every turn, that what happened underground stayed underground. To the outside world, many of them appeared to commute to unremarkable locations. The true nature of their work was not discussed at home, not mentioned to friends, not written in letters. Giant fans drove fresh air down through shafts from the surface, circulating it through the tunnels, and maintaining a stable temperature of around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone itself provided extraordinary thermal insulation. The temperature below barely shifted, regardless of whether it was summer or winter above. Humidity was controlled. Lighting was installed throughout. The corridors were given sign-posted names, a practical measure in a complex so large and confusing that workers could easily become disoriented. Internal roads allowed vehicles to move components between work areas. The operation was, by the standards of its time, remarkable. To lift the spirits of those who spent their days working in the drab and windowless tunnels, an artist named Olga Lehmann was invited underground in 1943. Using paints donated directly from the factory, the same colours used in aircraft production, she decorated the walls of the canteens with colourful murals, bright landscapes, cheerful scenes. A small act of humanity in a place that could easily have felt inhuman. Those murals survive to this day, protected now as Grade 2 star-listed structures, vivid reminders of the quiet determination of the people who worked below. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational pattern of the underground factory was shaped by the rhythms of the war above. During periods of heavy bombing, the advantage of the location was self-evident. While surface factories across Britain absorbed devastating raids, the tunnels continued their work in undisturbed silence. The Luftwaffe, for all its capability, could not reach them. No raid ever struck the facility. No bomb ever disrupted production. Whatever the Bristol Aeroplane Corporation was building underground, it built without interruption throughout the worst years of the war. Comparing the British experience at Corsham with German and American approaches to industrial protection reveals the extent to which the decision to go underground was, in retrospect, one of the smarter strategic choices made in the early years of the conflict. Germany, facing Allied bombing of increasing severity from 1942 onwards, pursued a similar strategy of underground dispersal, but later and under far greater duress. The underground factories at Nordhausen, most infamously the Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were produced using slave labour, were carved out under conditions of appalling brutality from 1943 onwards. The German programme was reactive, desperate, and in many respects catastrophic for those forced to build and work in it. The Corsham programme, by contrast, was proactive, planned before the worst of the bombing reached its peak, and executed using a civilian workforce operating under wartime conditions that, while demanding, bore no resemblance to the horrors of forced labour. American industrial dispersal took a different form, relying more heavily on geographical distance. The sheer size of the continent meant that most production facilities were simply beyond the range of Axis bombers, and on the construction of entirely new factories in inland locations, rather than the conversion of existing underground spaces. The United States had neither the tradition of extensive limestone quarrying that gave Britain its ready-made underground voids, nor the immediate urgency of being within striking distance of enemy airfields. The result was a less dramatic, but ultimately highly effective approach to the same problem. What made Corsham distinctive was precisely the combination of existing geological infrastructure and immediate strategic necessity. The tunnels were there, the threat was real. The decision to bring them together was made quickly and carried out effectively. In terms of output, engines produced, production continuity maintained, workers protected. The underground factory delivered on the purpose for which it had been designed. The impact of the Corsham tunnels during the Second World War is not easily measured in the way that a particular weapon or a specific military operation can be assessed. There is no single battle that turned on the engines produced beneath Wiltshire. There is no dramatic moment at which the underground factory visibly changed the course of events. Its contribution was structural, cumulative, and, appropriately enough, hidden. What can be said with confidence is this. At a moment when British industrial production was under sustained aerial attack, when factory workers in Bristol and other industrial cities were dying at their workbenches, and when the engines that powered RAF aircraft were among the most urgently needed items of war production, the Bristol Aeroplane Corporation continued to build those engines without a single day of bombing-related interruption. That continuity had a value that defies simple quantification. The psychological dimension is worth noting as well. For the workers who descended into Spring Quarry each morning, there was a particular quality to the knowledge that they could not be reached from above. The anxiety of air raids, the sirens, the shelters, the counting of seconds, the waiting for the all-clear, was simply absent from their working lives. They existed, during their shifts at least, in a world from which the war's most immediate terror had been excluded. Whether this translated into measurably higher productivity is impossible to say with certainty. But the human logic of it is straightforward enough. The tunnels also outlasted the purpose for which they were first converted. As the war ended and the immediate need for underground production disappeared, the extraordinary infrastructure that had been built beneath Corsham was not dismantled or abandoned. Britain was entering a new period of threat, the Cold War, and the same qualities that had made the tunnels valuable against Luftwaffe bombs made them potentially valuable against something far worse. The story of Corsham did not end in 1945. It merely changed form through the late 1940s and into the 1950s as the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, and the nature of the existential threat facing Britain was fundamentally transformed. Planners turned their attention once more to the tunnels beneath Wiltshire. What had been a wartime factory became the site of something more ambitious still, a plan to house the entire central government of the United Kingdom in the event of nuclear war. The facility that took shape over the following years, codenamed Burlington, also known at various times as Stockwell, Subterfuge, and Turnstile, was, in its Cold War incarnation, genuinely extraordinary. 37 metres below the surface, in the northern section of Spring Quarry, the government constructed a self-contained underground city covering 35 acres of floor space. The complex stretched for more than a kilometre from end to end. It contained offices, dormitories, kitchens, canteens, a hospital complete with operating facilities, a dental surgery, a bakery, a laundry, and storage for food and fuel, sufficient to sustain its occupants for 3 months. The Burlington bunker had its own underground lake, a reservoir capable of supplying drinking water to thousands of people without any connection to the surface supply. 12 large fuel tanks held enough diesel to keep 4 generators running continuously for 90 days. The ventilation system featured enormous butterfly valves capable of sealing the complex completely against nuclear fallout or gas attack within seconds. The internal road network, officially signposted with American-style street names such as First Avenue, was navigable only by battery-powered vehicles, the corridors being too long and the complex too large for walking to serve as practical transport. At its intended full capacity, Burlington was designed to accommodate approximately 4,000 people. The Prime Minister, the Cabinet, senior Whitehall officials, military commanders, communication staff, and the technical personnel required to keep the complex functioning. The Prime Minister had his own suite. A BBC broadcasting studio was maintained within the complex, from which the head of government could address whatever remained of the nation. The telephone exchange, the second largest in Britain, would have connected Burlington to the outside world through hardened communications links. The royal family under the plan would have travelled by a secret branch line connecting Burlington to the main Great Western Railway between London and Bristol. Senior ministers and civil servants would have assembled in carefully managed groups at Kensington Olympia Station, believing they were bound for an unspecified destination, before being transported to Corsham by train and then lorry. The Prime Minister would have arrived by helicopter, remaining at Downing Street until the final possible moment. None of this was ever used. Burlington was maintained in operational readiness from the late 1950s through to the early 1990s, costing the government approximately £500,000 per year to keep in a state of readiness. The complex was kept stocked with tinned food, office equipment, stationery, and the full apparatus of government administration. In the storerooms, boxes of government-issue glass ashtrays and civil service tea sets sat unopened on metal shelves, waiting for a moment that never came. When the Cold War ended and the site was finally decommissioned in 2004, those boxes remained exactly where they had been placed years or decades before, still sealed, still unused. The declassification of Burlington in 2004 was itself a remarkable event. For nearly 50 years, the British government had denied the existence of the facility, deflecting inquiries with practiced vagueness. Urban explorers had pushed at its edges. Conspiracy theorists had circled its perimeter. The Ministry of Defence had maintained its denials through administrations of every political colour, through decades of peace and crisis alike. When the acknowledgement finally came, it was received with a mixture of astonishment and something very close to pride. The realisation that beneath an ordinary Cotswold market town, Britain had prepared in extraordinary and meticulous detail for the unthinkable. Return now to September 1940, to the tunnels, to the smell of stone dust and oil, to the woman with a clipboard walking briskly down a corridor named, in some internal document that will not be read for decades, with a designation that gives nothing away. She does not know what the tunnels will become. She does not know that in 15 years, the government of the United Kingdom will be preparing to move into the chambers that lie just beyond the section where she works. She does not know that a Cold War will follow this war, or that the same geography that keeps her safe from Luftwaffe bombs will one day be designated as the last refuge of British democracy against something even more final. What she knows is that her work is important, that the engines she helps to build will fly in aeroplanes that are fighting, at this very moment, over the fields of southern England. That the ordinary fact of her presence underground doing her job in conditions of absolute secrecy is a small but genuine contribution to something larger than herself. This is what the tunnels of Corsham represent, at the deepest level. Not just the ingenuity of their construction, or the ambition of Burlington's Cold War purpose, or the extraordinary fact that somewhere beneath a sleepy Wiltshire town, a city for 4,000 people was assembled and maintained in secret for half a century. It represents something simpler and harder to quantify, the determination to continue, to find a way, to go underground if necessary, to carve the means of survival out of solid rock if necessary, to do whatever it takes in secret and without acknowledgement and without thanks. The tunnels kept the factories running when the bombers came. They kept the government's last resort ready through the long decades of the Cold War. They were never needed for their ultimate purpose. And that, of course, is the best possible outcome. The city below Corsham exists today as a monument not to catastrophe, but to preparation. Not to the worst that happened, but to the worst that was feared. Beneath the honey-coloured streets of Corsham, in the pale limestone chambers where aircraft engines were once built, and governments once planned to survive the unsurvivable, the murals painted by Olga Lehmann still glow in the darkness. Bright colours in a place designed for the darkest of possibilities. Britain built its secrets deep, and some of them are deeper still.